They told us they came to bring light, that we were living in darkness, that they arrived on ships carrying the sun in one hand and salvation in the other. But if you look closer, if you strip back the words written in their books, the sermons preached on their pulpits, the speeches carved into marble, you'll find three things that tell the truth of colonization: gold, God, and guns. The gold was not always literal. Sometimes it was rubber, sometimes ivory, sometimes diamonds or spices or land. But make no mistake, it was always about wealth. Empire does not move without profit. No country sails across oceans for kindness. When Portuguese and Spanish ships first touched the shores of Africa, they didn't ask about the people. They asked about gold. Where is it? Who owns it? How do we get it? They found it in Ghana, then called the Gold Coast. They found it in the rivers, in the dust, in the hands of miners who had been trading with North Africans long before Europe woke up from its medieval sleep. But trade was too slow. Trade required respect. So they brought the gun. With it, they took what had once been shared. They built forts, like Elmina, that whitewashed fortress still standing by the sea, beautiful and blood-soaked. They traded gunpowder for bodies. They exchanged death for profit. Then they carved up the land, not with maps, not yet, but with violence. And when their swords grew heavy with blood, they wiped them clean with the cloth of religion. They said, "We come in the name of God." They said, "Your spirits are demons." They said, "Your gods must be destroyed." In the Americas, they broke the backs of temples. They melted golden statues into coins. They baptized children with water that had the taste of blood in it. But here's what they don't say. It was never just about God. It was about using God, twisting him, reshaping him, to justify conquest. Because a man with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other is not there to save you. He's there to silence you. They called it the mission. They said they were civilizing people. But what does it mean to civilize someone whose civilizations are older than your own? The kingdoms of Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, Benin, these were empires with trade systems, written laws, armies, and artistry so refined that European visitors often couldn't believe what they saw. But the colonizer does not conquer with awe. He conquers by pretending not to see. So they saw nothing. Not the city of Timbuktu, filled with books and scholars. Not the intricate governance of the Ashanti or the spiritual depth of the Yoruba. Not the water systems in pre-colonial India or the architectural genius of the Mayans. They closed their eyes to it all. Because to conquer someone, you must first convince yourself they are beneath you. And what better way to do that than with religion? They painted their God white. They made him speak their language. Then they handed him to the colonized like a gift and demanded loyalty in return. They built churches on stolen land. They preached peace after war. They offered forgiveness after theft. But always the gold kept moving. From South America to Spain. From West Africa to Europe. From Indian ports to British palaces. And still, they told the story backward. They said, "We found savages." They said, "We brought salvation." They said, "They were lost. We showed them the way." But ask yourself this, who really lost their way? The people who lived in rhythm with the land, or the ones who came to rip it apart for profit? Who were the barbarians? The ones who danced around fires and told stories of the stars, or the ones who burned libraries and enslaved children in the name of a crown? They say colonization brought roads, laws, railways. But those roads led to mines. Those laws protected their wealth. Those railways carried stolen goods to ships waiting at the coast. Colonization wasn't development. It was extraction. They didn't come to build. They came to take. And every time they told the story, they left out the guns, left out the torture, left out the hands chopped off in Congo for not meeting rubber quotas, left out the decapitated rebels, left out the women taken, the cultures mocked, the sacred things burned. They left out the silence, the deep silence that settles over a people who have been robbed not just of land, but of memory. But memory fights back. And now, the truth is rising again. This is not the story they taught you in school. This is not the version written by victors. This is what was whispered in the dark, passed down in prayer, kept alive in song and story and scar. This is what they really came for. And we haven't even told it all. They didn't conquer the world all at once. They tested it first. They arrived as guests, traders, missionaries, friends. They learned the land, learned the people, learned where the wealth was hidden, not just in the ground, but in alliances, rivalries, and weaknesses. And when they had learned enough, they returned with force. By the late 1800s, Europe was hungry. Factories were growing. Machines demanded fuel. Empires needed raw materials, rubber for tires, cotton for clothes, palm oil for industry, diamonds for prestige, gold for power. Europe was industrializing fast, and the cost of that progress would be paid far away by people who would never see the benefits. So they gathered in rooms far from Africa. In Berlin, in 1884, powerful European men sat around tables and divided an entire continent with rulers and ink. No African leaders were present. No consent was asked for. Rivers became borders. Ethnic groups were split. Enemies were forced together. Allies were torn apart. That meeting, polite, quiet, orderly, caused chaos that still burns today. They called it diplomacy, but it was theft with manners. And once the borders were drawn, the guns followed. In the Congo, one man claimed an entire country as his personal property. King Leopold II of Belgium never set foot there, but his shadow was everywhere. His agents demanded rubber quotas that were impossible to meet. Villages that failed were punished. Hands were cut off. Children were taken hostage. Entire communities were wiped out, not for rebellion, but for profit. And all of it was justified. They said it was progress. They said it was civilization. They said it was God's will. Missionaries walked beside soldiers, often arriving first, softening the ground. They learned the local language, translated the Bible, built churches and schools. And while some genuinely believed they were helping, the system they served was brutal. The missionary taught obedience. The soldier enforced it. The administrator collected the reward. In India, the British East India Company didn't arrive as a government. It arrived as a business, a corporation with its own army. They manipulated kings, exploited divisions, and slowly took control of an entire subcontinent. They drained wealth that had made India one of the richest regions in the world, turning it into a supplier of raw materials and a market for British goods. Famines followed. Millions died, not because food didn't exist, but because it was exported. Grain left starving villages under armed guard, while British officials debated policy and profit. And still, they spoke of order. They spoke of law. They spoke of God. Christianity was reshaped into a tool of control. Passages about obedience were emphasized. Resistance was framed as sin. Suffering was portrayed as noble. Heaven was promised later, as long as submission came now. Traditional beliefs were labeled pagan. Sacred groves were destroyed. Ancestral practices were criminalized. Drums were banned. Languages were discouraged. Names were replaced. Children were taught to be ashamed of their parents. This was not accidental, because once you break a people's spirit, you no longer need chains. The gun was loud, but God was quieter and often more effective. Colonization taught people to police themselves, to doubt their own knowledge, to see their past as backward and their future as dependent on the empire. It taught them that their salvation came from outside, that progress had a foreign face. But the truth kept slipping through the cracks. Rebellions erupted everywhere. Some armed, some spiritual, some cultural. From the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya to the Indian Rebellion of 1857, from the Zulu resistance to the Ashanti Wars, people fought back with whatever they had. Spears against rifles, prayers against cannons, songs against laws. They lost many battles, but they never stopped resisting. Because beneath the gold being shipped away, beneath the sermons being preached, beneath the guns enforcing order, there was something the colonizers never fully understood. The people knew they were being lied to. They could feel it in their hunger. They could see it in their broken land. They could hear it in the silence where drums used to be. The empire's greatest weapon was not the gun. It was the story. A story that said, "We came to help." A story that said, "You were nothing before us." A story that said, "This suffering is necessary." And for a long time, that story worked. But stories can be rewritten. And the closer the empires came to their peak, the closer they were to collapse. Because gold runs out, guns rust, and a god used for oppression eventually loses his grip. What came next would shake empires, expose lies, and force the world to confront what had really been done in the name of progress. But that part of the story, that is still unfolding. They said the sun would never set on the empire. But it did, slowly, and not peacefully. The colonies rose, not all at once, but like waves, each revolt building on the last. After centuries of stolen gold, silenced gods, and smoking guns, the people who had been called savages stood up and said, "No more." The British called them rebels. The French called them ungrateful. The Belgians, the Portuguese, the Dutch, they all said the same thing. "We brought you civilization." But the colonized had seen too much to believe that anymore. In India, the cry for independence had begun in whispers, then in newspapers, then in marches, then in blood. The British had built a vast network of railways, not for the people, but to move goods, troops, and wealth more efficiently. But those same railways would now carry the news of protest. The streets filled with people, arms empty, but voices loud. Gandhi's movement of nonviolence was not a weakness, it was a weapon. It exposed the lie that British rule was orderly and just. When peaceful protesters were shot in places like Amritsar, the world saw what the empire really was. In Africa, the fire spread through forests and towns. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rose with machetes and memory, fighting for land that had been stolen and fenced. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah declared that the colonized had learned enough, not from books, but from suffering, and were now ready to write their own future. The same flags that had been raised in conquest were now being burned in revolution. But it was never easy. The colonizers didn't leave willingly. In Algeria, the French clung to power with bullets and torture. In Congo, the Belgians pretended to hand over freedom while installing puppets. In Mozambique and Angola, Portugal fought brutal wars to keep control. Independence was never a gift. It was taken, piece by piece, body by body. And when the colonizers finally packed up their flags and sailed away, they left behind more than scars. They left borders that made no sense, lines drawn through villages, rivers, and families. They left languages that were not native. They left economic systems designed to extract, not develop. They left schools that still taught colonial history. They left minds that had been trained to doubt themselves. Because while the gold and guns had done their damage, it was the story of God, the deeper idea that whiteness meant modernity, that Europe meant order, that everything native was inferior, that lingered the longest. Even after freedom came, the old ideas didn't die. They just changed clothes. Colonial rule turned into neocolonial control. New leaders wore suits instead of uniforms, but often followed the same script. Corporations replaced governments. Loans replaced armies. And the gold kept moving, just now through trade deals and offshore banks. The church bells still rang in cities where temples had once stood. The schools still taught Shakespeare, but not Shaka. The people still bore the names given to their ancestors by missionaries. Colonization, it turned out, didn't need to be visible to be alive. But something else had survived too. The stories. The real ones. The stories told at night, around fires, passed from grandmother to grandchild. The stories that were not written in books, but remembered in bones. The stories that said, you were never nothing. You were never lost. You were stolen. And now, you are coming back. Because now, the descendants of the colonized are speaking, writing, filming, singing, reclaiming what was buried. They are telling the world what really happened, what the colonizers really came for, and what they left behind. But this isn't just about the past. The story is not over. Because gold still glitters, guns still fire, and the story of God is still used, in some places, to divide, to shame, to silence. So the question remains, what comes next? They told us it was over. That colonialism was something from the past. That independence meant freedom. That the empire packed its flags and sailed off into history. But if you look around, really look, you'll see that it never truly left. It just changed form. The gold still moves. Now it's hidden behind corporate names and investment deals. Oil, cobalt, lithium, cocoa, coltan, mined from the same lands that bled under empire, now extracted by foreign hands through friendly handshakes and smiling contracts. The flags are gone, but the profit still flows in the same direction, out. The guns still fire, sometimes openly, in war zones funded by powers far away. Sometimes quietly, in the form of armed police, private security, and sanctions that starve nations into submission. The bullets may be different, but the violence still speaks the same language. And as for God, He's still there too. In the textbooks that erase ancient knowledge. In the sermons that call native belief systems evil. In the way some still believe that white means right. That development must look European. That progress must be copied. That African names are too hard to pronounce. That Western approval is a goal, not a warning. This is the aftershock of colonization. The part that happens after the blood dries. The part they don't teach you in school. The mental war. The war for memory. The war for the right to tell your own story. But something is shifting. You can feel it in the voices rising. In the books being written. In the songs reclaiming stolen rhythms. In the names being spoken with pride again. Decolonization is not just about taking down a flag. It's about taking back the narrative. It's about asking hard questions. Why do our school books still begin with the arrival of colonizers? Why do we celebrate the discovery of lands where people already lived? Why are some gods called mythology and others called truth? Why are our children still being told that civilization came from outside? It's about rebuilding what was broken, not to go back, but to go forward in our own image. It's about honoring the resistance that came before us. The ones who said no, even when it cost them everything. The ones who had knowledge in drums, in dances, in secret languages. The ones who knew, deep down, that freedom was not a gift. It was a right. And now, it is our turn. To remember the stories they buried. To teach the names they erased. To dance the dances they once banned. To question everything we were told was true. To stand in the ruins they left behind and build something honest. Colonialism didn't fail because the empires became weak. It failed because the people refused to forget who they were. That's the real story. That's what they came for, not just gold or land or labor. They came for identity, for power over the soul. And in the end, they couldn't take it. Because even in silence, memory speaks. Even in chains, spirit moves. Even in ruins, the truth remains. We are still here, and the story is still ours.